Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to tonight's Royal Television Society Technology Centre virtual event. You are highly encouraged to make use of the Q&A box here on Zoom, and we'll hopefully have time to get to a few of your questions at the end of the conversation. To introduce myself, I'm Kim Rowell. I'm Managing Editor of News Production for ITN, a trustee and board member for UN Women UK, and a Royal Television Society Technology Centre committee member. It gives me great pleasure to have organised this event for you this evening and to be able to introduce you to Marianna Spring, the BBC's first disinformation and social media correspondent and an award-winning journalist. Marianna presents podcasts and documentaries investigating disinformation and social media for BBC Radio 4, as well as for Panorama and BBC 3. She's also one of the presenters of the BBC's Americast podcast. In 2022, Marianna was named the British Press Guild's Audio Presenter of the Year and Royal Television Society Innovation winner. And this year, Marianna received the Gold Award at the ARIAs in the Best Speech Presenter category and Best Host at the British Podcast Awards. Marianna, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, and to everyone who's come along. I really appreciate it.
It's fantastic. It would be great to hear more to get us started about how it all started for you. And as we've said, you work now as the BBC's first disinformation and social media correspondent, which is so new and of the moment, and not a role that you could have probably put on your wish list for a careers advisor. And in fact, a recent reviewer described your job title as a necessary product of the age. Could you have ever imagined that this would be your vocation?
No, I was someone who, from when I was really little, I wanted to be a journalist. I used to love kind of watching the news, which was a bit strange for someone who is in there. At that time, I was about eight years old. I wanted to be a journalist. I was really into kind of finding out what's going on in the world, and I love the idea that there was a job where you got to find stuff out and tell people about it. And when I was at school, I did a lot of writing for my local paper, things like that. And I studied French and Russian at university, which I think was the beginning for me of an interest in sort of propaganda and information wars, and thinking about how social media in particular can be used to distort or change the online conversation. And when I was at university was the 2016 election in the United States, where there were lots of conversations about kind of this concept of fake news or disinformation in a way that I hadn't really noticed before. And so it was from there really that I think my interest in, and I was someone who grew up with social media as well. It was something that I used as a teenager and became a kind of intrinsic part of my life, as it has loads of people's lives. And so when I graduated, I did various bits of work experience at The Guardian and at Private Eye, places like that. And when I graduated, I started doing shifts at Newsnight, and doing all sorts, like booking guests, all kinds of things like that. And then I started pitching quite a few investigations about kind of the role social media had played in shaping elections and so on. And it's been really interesting to see how this job has evolved. So I investigated sort of social media around the election in 2019. And then when actually was ahead of the last US election, there was a kind of decision within the BBC that it would be worth having someone dedicated to investigating this social media world. So my job came into fruition, came to exist. And then obviously the pandemic happened, and I feel like I've never not been busy since. And very much my job, for people who've sort of not encountered it before, is, often I think I'm wrongly called things like a fact checker. And actually, while I think fact checking is really important, what I do is much more like investigative journalism sort of in the social media world. And I think that's really important, because I think fact checking on its own, unfortunately, can't often reach the audiences and people who would find it positive to listen and engage with this kinds of reporting.
That's really interesting. And I imagine that each day is a little bit different for you. Do you have a typical day at all? Is there any kind of structure and routine to it? Or is it responding, like you say, to what's going on in the world?
Yeah, it kind of depends, really. Actually, today, the reason I joined this Zoom just in time is because I've been doing quite a lot about the hurricane that's been happening in the United States, and the way that social media has pushed disinformation about the hurricane and conspiracy theories and the impact that's had and so on. So there are big breaking news events where sort of I will offer reactive analysis or more investigative, original kind of reporting. I've just been writing something for the website. I can see the person who's editing it sending me messages as I talk to you.
Not right now.
Not right now. No,
Hold
don't worry. I'm
on.
not reading them. And then a lot of what I do is also working on longer term projects, which is a slightly more predictable. So the Radio 4 podcast, like you mentioned, BBC Panorama. I've done work for BBC Three as well. And so with those, that's much more of a, you know, when they're going to be going out, you have decided what you want to investigate, you've tracked the people down, you go out and gather it and do it. So that's the kind of going out and about bits. And then when you're back here at the BBC, which is where I am now, you will work out sort of like, right, how are you going to shape the narrative of that podcast? And you work with brilliant production teams to sort of bring it to life. Same with Panorama investigations and so on. So those days look slightly less bonkers than days where I also lob in a kind of major news event. But I think that increasingly that is the way that correspondent jobs in broadcast work, which is that you work across different media, you know, podcasts, TV, radio, online, social media, and everything else. And actually, you kind of have to learn to do all the different paces and all the different types, which I really love because it means you get to reach as many people as possible. And because no one's ever done my job before, it's brilliant because I can slightly set the tone of what a normal day looks like, which is not very normal, to be quite honest.
It's quite refreshing to be able to forge your own path in that way. And I'm sure a lot of people joining tonight have joined obviously because the title is Misinformation, Disinformation, Conspiracy Theories. It would be great to hear your take on the differentiation between these terms. And I mean, obviously the boundaries between them must get blurred quite regularly.
Yeah, a
It'd
lot.
be great to hear what your take is on that.
Yeah, they interact with each other a lot in some ways, and there's kind of quite a lot of overlap, a bit like a Venn diagram, really. So misinformation is the catch-all term that we use to describe misleading or false claims, but they might not have been shared on purpose. Someone might have just shared them because they believed them or they thought they were true at the time. So misinformation, I often think of the M as meaning misleading. Disinformation is like a subset of misinformation. So it's where someone is deliberately sharing misleading content. It can often be quite hard to prove that they are intending to mislead or intending to cause harm in that way. Think of the D as meaning deliberate, which is quite helpful. And then conspiracy theories are unfounded theories, which are almost defined by their sort of absence of evidence. And conspiracy theories, what's quite difficult about them is often they're not categorically false. You can't say, well, hang on, here's stuff that disproves this theory. Sometimes they will be so outlandish that actually it's almost like, you know, there's no way of disproving them. And that's why we'll often use words like without evidence or evidence-free or unproven and that sort of thing, or contrary to the evidence. And they can overlap. So, for example, lots of people who share kind of certain types of conspiracy theories will also share a lot of kind of false claims and then broadly share disinformation, stuff that they're kind of intending to mislead others with. And when it comes to the work I do, a lot of that is about disinformation within the social media sphere. So lots of my colleagues at the BBC will do, for example, fact checking of what politicians are saying and whether it's true or not. Whereas my job is very much about investigating how, I think, very much sort of social media disinformation, hate, algorithms, and on the disinformation front, it's sort of who's sharing it, why, who believes it and why, and the real world consequences of all of that. And what the social media companies are doing or most aptly not doing most of the time.
Yeah, so okay, so misleading, deliberate, not categorically false. Those
exactly.
Kind of
exactly.
Fantastic. Okay. And I mean, clearly it is such a tricky and quite nuanced path for you to walk. And it's true to say you had quite a substantial backlash following this. And there was a publication of an article that I wanted to pick this out specifically because it's just so shocking to me. You wrote an article for BBC News in 2023 on an increase in trolling and online abuse on Twitter, of which Elon Musk mockingly retweeted you, which then led to you receiving more than 80% of all online abuse directed at BBC journalists in the first 6 months of that year. I mean, we're speaking now on World Mental Health Day, but I mean, how do you manage that kind of kickback?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's something that I've factored in now. So investigating this very specific social media world triggers a wave of trolls, conspiracy theorists, in a way that I I didn't used to experience. But I think for me, the most positive way of dealing with that is that I sort of wouldn't be doing my job right if these people, if I wasn't getting that kind of response from the sorts of people I'm investigating. And I always like to, exercise quite a lot of empathy in the reporting I do and treat people, with respect. And I do that across the board, even when I'm holding someone accountable. But unfortunately, there are people who just will not and do not like this kind of investigative journalism, and they don't want you to do it. And so you find yourself subject to abuse that goes way beyond legitimate criticism, which I'm more than happy to have. People sending you rape threats, death threats, really extreme abuse. I think that for me, I'm really fortunate as well. I don't receive homophobic abuse or racist abuse or other kinds of hate that other people are subject to. But what I would say for me in terms of coping with it is that I find actually it enriches my understanding of the world that I investigate, because it helps me better understand the tactics at play, how hate can be used to to target individuals, how disinformation can be used to do that too, who shares it and why, how it can often trigger what I call the shock troops, like one big account like Elon Musk's will share your photo or take aim at you, and then you get dozens and dozens and dozens of other messages from their followers. So I think that if I like to investigate my kind of own experience of trolling often, because I think it helps me to better understand how this works. And also for the people I speak to who are affected by this, it means that they feel like I get it, perhaps not, to the same extremes often they've experienced, but that I am able to and want to understand why this is happening. I think on the Elon Musk point specifically, I think it's very important to be able to hold the social media companies who are very rich and very powerful accountable. And someone like Elon Musk spends a lot of time talking about how the media do not hold power to account, and suggesting that we kind of parrot what we're told to say and stuff like this. Not my experience, certainly, of the journalism I do. And so I find it quite a worry when someone like that will not do an interview, will not speak to you, will not answer your questions, but then will send trolls your way, whether intentionally or not. And when we're talking about freedom of expression, I think it's important that we kind of acknowledge that. And I wouldn't want talking about the online abuse to ever put people off being, wanting to be journalists, or anyone that's thinking about becoming a journalist, because I really love what I do. And in fact, I wouldn't probably tolerate that level of abuse if I didn't really love what I was doing. But I think, unfortunately, it is part and parcel a little bit of being a journalist in any field, but particularly if you investigate social media now.
And you have reached out to Elon Musk a few times, haven't you? You said, talk to me, let's have a dialogue. And like you say,
Yeah, and I don't get any
and
response. Yeah, the only response I've ever had was that thread where he shared the image of me and then kind of made a bit of a joke, and that triggered a lot of trolling. But he won't respond to questions, and when you send right of replies, so allegations via email, you just don't get a response. Which is, if that were happening, for example, when we tried to hold to account a government minister or a politician, I think people would be pretty outraged. The other social media companies often do respond. There are questions about how effectively they respond, but they do respond. Whereas X don't do that anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to keep investigating these areas, because it's our job as journalists to kind of hold people and power to account in that way.
Yeah, and it's this online ecosystem that you've spoken about how it's arguably attractive to a generation that's living with this amount of negativity. So we've got like the rise of loneliness, an absence of community, and a lack of real world connections. But it sounds very much that you feel that there's a role for journalism to play to help mitigate this for a viewer or the audience.
Yeah, I do. I think that a lot of the things that lead people towards conspiracy theory movements on social media are, things like distrust, like you say, kind of people feeling isolated or lonely or not feeling like they have anywhere to turn, feeling kind of purposeless or looking for purpose and looking for community. And it's why I really think it's important when you're doing this kinds of journalism to really show your workings and take the audience with you. I think if people can, really trust what you're saying, they know you've done the investigations yourself, they're coming with you as you do that work, they see how it works, they see the mechanics of how that works. I think that's really important. And I think that helps in some ways to combat both levels of distrust, and then also to combat when people are feeling like, oh, I feel like I'm on the outside and I need to trust these people. It's actually saying, hang on a second, you might be being conned by these people, and let me show you how and why and the tactics that are at play. Because I think our job as journalists should feel like we're sticking up for the average person rather than the opposite. And I think that's kind of part of the solution here. I often really focus on the real world consequences of this stuff and the human impact. Because I think that some of this can feel a little bit niche sometimes and a little bit abstract or techie or geeky in that way. And I think if people can relate to it and they understand how it relates to their lives and they can see the real world consequences of this stuff, they're much more likely to pay attention. Like in some ways, it's using the very same things that allow disinformation to go so viral. Actually really telling the story, bringing it to life, bringing your audience with you, that then makes people go, oh, okay, I totally get what's going on here and I'm interested in it and I want to know more. And it could be a bit of a kind of endless whack-a-mole if you were doing this job and you tried to investigate every single story or every single thing. Instead, I often choose to investigate stories where lots of people are getting in touch and where they are emblematic of particular tactics being used on social media or particular phenomena. So I'm doing a new podcast series at the moment called Why Do You Hate Me USA? And in those episodes, I've investigated kind of different social media phenomena, but that are emblematic of particular issues online. So conspiracy theories, hate, targeting election workers, AI generated clips that tore apart kind of communities and towns. And I hope that helps all of us better understand sort of how this works and kind of equip ourselves against getting drawn into stuff that's not true, or particularly being aware of how our algorithms are shaping the way we look at the world.
This brings me very nicely. You've teed this up perfectly. So there was a recent review of your podcast, Why Do You Hate Me, following its release in the US. And it's, if you allow me to read it, it's very indicative of you and your journalistic approach. It says, I was dubious about this series. Conspiracists hate mainstream media, so why bother yet again giving them so much space on it? My bad. What's refreshing about Spring is that she doesn't make conspiracists or online haters seem like freaks, but like something far more normal. Her careful, low-key hosting makes us understand that these people aren't odd for the sake of it, but because of the world they live in. Would you say that's a fair assessment of your journalistic approach?
I have to say I was really happy with that review, only because that is kind of my goal, I guess. So it's when you set out to do something and then someone reviews it and they kind of take away the one thing you really wanted them to
Do they
take
get
away.
what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's always
yeah.
brilliant, because sometimes you might be aiming to do something, but you don't necessarily know if people will interpret it in the same way you have. I think really strongly that empathy is really important here, and understanding sort of why people believe what they do and how they get pulled down what we often call the conspiracy theory rabbit hole and the impact it has for them. And often I meet people, she's referring to episode 1 there, where I met 2 women, one called Wild Mother and one called Camille, both who believe that the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in July was staged without any evidence to support that idea. And they're from very different kind of political backgrounds, and they're quite different in lots of ways, but they've both been drawn in by their algorithms on social media to believing this stuff. And they also have kind of pre-existing reasons, distrust broadly in society and the media, that have kind of led them to that point. And they're both wonderful. I loved meeting them. I loved talking to them. I'm so grateful that they trusted me to kind of investigate their lives and what happened. But they do happen to believe these things, and those things kind of can cause harm or, undermine general trust in how society works. And that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think that it's so important to kind of exercise empathy, particularly when you're speaking to the people who aren't necessarily, the super spreaders of disinformation who are making money out of this or causing harm to other people or sharing hate in a way that's, really, consequential, but actually the people who are in themselves almost kind of like victims of this too, like they're drawn into it, they believe it, it's affected their lives. And I think helping people understand how, in the case of both of these women, without social media, I have no doubt that they would not believe what they believe, and they wouldn't be at that point. And so I think it's just really important to really try and understand. I think also because people can feel, and the whole reason people get sucked into this, to your earlier point, is because they feel alienated and isolated and ridiculed. And so you have to take seriously what people are saying and actually interrogate the things they're telling you. And actually, I find sometimes you can get a bit twisty if you get stuck in on what someone believes. Like often it will be very complex and sometimes it might not make that much sense. But if you can ask people why they believe what they believe and how they got there and what they're seeing on their social media feeds, I think it really reveals something to the audience. And that's what you want people to take away, as per that review, that they say, oh, okay, so what's happening here is actually kind of to do with social media's algorithms. So maybe, we should be looking towards the social media companies and the impact that they're having and what they're doing, because actually these individuals on their own are sort of not, there would be no value in me. I wouldn't want to, because it's just not what I'm like as a person, but there would also be no value in me sort of like making fun of or laughing at or ridiculing these theories to these women, because that wouldn't contribute to kind of revealing the solutions here. And I think that's the problem, is you can focus on the individuals a lot, and I think they really do reveal to us something about how this world online works and why people behave how they do. But they are just individuals, and you could speak to dozens and dozens of people who believe this stuff, and it probably would make no difference. But what could make a difference is people feeling like they understand why this is happening and the tactics at play. And I think it's for that reason that that approach, I hope, is one that works. And also, really interestingly, like when that podcast episode went out, both of the women in it were really happy with it, which you take away as, I think there's maybe a misconception that people must think, and a lot of people do, they hate the BBC, they hate me. I mean, the podcast is literally called Why Do You Hate Me? But they take away the fact that they feel as though you've been respectful and fair and accurate is really important to me. And when you leave, they know that you're saying, oh, hang on, these conspiracy theories aren't without evidence, sure, but you're actually, listening to them and hearing what they have to say, and not unduly amplifying stuff that's not true or condoning stuff that's harmful, but allowing people to kind of explain for themselves why they're doing what they're doing. Someone recently said to me that it's a bit like being half investigative journalist and half anthropologist. Do you think that sometimes?
Sounds about right. It sounds about right. I think it's key. What you're kind of alluding to in my mind is being representative of society. And I think the challenge we have this year is the election. It's such an enormous election year. And again, to quote what you say in the podcast, it's social media's world and the election is just living in it. And it's going to be such a seismic year, and it has been such a seismic year. But the interesting thing I found, if the UK election is anything to go by, disinformation, AI, deepfakes, they arguably didn't play as big a role as we were anticipating from a news media point of view. And they've even proven, there's some recent research I read from CETAS, which is a research centre based at the Alan Turing Institute, and identified only 16 cases of AI-enabled disinformation or deepfakes during the UK general election. However, it did identify evidence of deepfakes inciting online hate against political figures and then threatening their personal safety, and confusion over whether AI-generated content is real and that damaging trust, and also politicians using AI in their campaign ads and therefore incentivizing unethical behavior going forwards. But I suppose my question to you is, in the wake of all of this, where does this leave us with the upcoming US elections? And what do we need to be concerned and vigilant about in this space as both journalists and for the viewers and the audience?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because with the UK election, all of the kind of polling at the time, which was kind of broadly correct, suggested it wasn't that close. And I think that probably plays a part in why disinformation, AI fakes just didn't really feel like they were having the impact that maybe some people had feared or anticipated that they could. I did investigate, so I run these things called my undercover voters, which are fictional characters based on research. They're totally private, but they allow me to investigate public social media feeds and what people are being recommended. And on their feeds during the UK election, there were some examples of networks of accounts that were, sharing deepfake clips of politicians saying stuff they hadn't said about, for example, the war in Gaza, that, could be harmful and could have had an impact. But broadly, it was unlikely to change the overall outcome of the election because of the way that the polls were looking and the way that the results ended up. So I think that there were important and interesting things that we kind of took away from that election, both in terms of the tactics that are effective, like deepfake audio, for example, because things that sound secretly recorded can be really, really convincing to people. Similarly, like about algorithms and about the way that algorithms, gaming the algorithm as a political party more generally seems to be more valuable than paying loads and loads for adverts, because your content seems genuine and authentic, and you kind of want your supporters to feel as though they can create their own content and share this stuff. It's something that we see happening in the US election too, both with Donald Trump supporters and with Kamala Harris's supporters now too. So Brat Summer and all of that stuff that we saw over the summer. So I think you take some lessons from it, but I think the difference with this US election is the same tactics are at play, but the margins are much, much slighter in terms of the difference between at least what the polls are telling us about who could win the election. It's very, very close. And what that means is a deep faked audio of an election official saying something they never really said, or some AI generated images that might be illustrative, but actually some people believe. I've investigated examples of fake images showing black voters supporting Donald Trump, which I've then spoken to real voters who believed those to be true and so on. And that kind of solidified or impacted their opinions. It's all of that kind of stuff that could actually have a tangible impact. Similarly, I've been investigating everything from doxing to people believing conspiracy theories about everything and anything being staged, which can put them off voting because they don't really trust the system anymore, to the Swifties and how Taylor Swift's fans and fandoms are kind of springing into action and trying to create their own content. So I think that if we look at the very fine margins, and we also look at the states where those margins really matter, Pennsylvania, for example, one deepfake, if it succeeded in reaching a couple of million people and convincing some of those people not to vote or to vote one way or another, one bit of disinformation that really, really sticks or that solidifies over time, that could make a difference. And I think that's why it's important to kind of investigate these tactics and help people understand what's happening. I think that the other thing that matters is what happens afterwards. And that's because during the 2020 election, there were various unfounded and false claims about the election being stolen. There were the Capitol riots that happened on the 6th of January that were inspired in part by disinformation that the election had been stolen. And this time around, you've got people on both sides who are feeling very disillusioned, who believe things have been rigged and staged, who don't feel like they can trust the system anymore, who've become increasingly sort of polarized within their echo chambers. And these are the minority of people, but it feels like that minority is a little bit louder and more sizable even than it was back in 2020. And the question is how they respond and how politicians respond, depending on what the result is. And I think it's for that reason that some of this disinformation matters too, not because it will necessarily swing the outcome, and it's impossible to prove that anyways, but that it might affect how people behave once the vote has happened and whether they believe violence to be justified in any way.
I find it fascinating because I always think about Brexit and how I was obviously in my own little social media algorithm echo chamber, convinced that it wasn't going to happen, and then it did. And I think what you're talking about now really speaks to that. And I'd be interested to know, obviously, you've mentioned your concerns around AI generated audio. Is there any other facet of evolving technology that concerns you in this space, particularly when it comes to the US election?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I bang on about far too much is about algorithms, which maybe don't feel that new and innovative in terms of, on the scale of they are AI, but not generative AI. But I think that so much of what I investigate right now comes down to algorithms and changes on the social media sites in terms of how their For You pages or For You feeds work. So the way you can be recommended stuff from people you don't know, you've never met before, you've never kind of ideas you never would have sought out before. And you start to notice how, so a good example is the two women I mentioned earlier, Camille, who had never ever in her life believed anything had been staged before. She says she'd never posted that kind of word. She'd never used it. She was very opposed to people believing COVID-19 was staged, the pandemic, which was false, obviously. She was very opposed to other false claims that the election had been rigged or stolen. But yet she found herself using the same words that she hated because other accounts she supported online who didn't like Donald Trump very much, she's voted Democrat for the past 15 years, were using those words and they were being actively recommended to her social media feeds. And because they agree with her, she kind of trusts them and she thinks, oh, well, they must be right because they're on my team, they're in my tribe, and this is now what we all think. And I think it's that change for me that has really shifted like the way that people view elections and politics and everything that's going on. It shapes their own perspectives and ideas. They're exposed to ideas often unfounded or not true that they wouldn't have sought out before. They just wouldn't have, they wouldn't have searched for them. They've been actively recommended them. And not just that, but seeing people they agree with and seeing millions of people see these things and like them and engage with them distorts their perception of sort of what everybody else thinks and what's sort of socially acceptable and what's not. And that's when I think you get into this realm of real world consequences too. And this wasn't the case for Camille and Wild Mother, but there are other people who will see these kinds of conspiracy theories and then people might suggest, for example, that violence is permitted because people believe that this theory is true, so you need to attack or target the person who you believe is kind of enforcing it. And if you see millions of other people sort of watching and liking that, then maybe there is someone watching that who thinks that's an okay sort of course of behavior. And there's real concerns around political violence, not least because of the assassination attempts on Donald Trump, the one that happened in July, and the attempted one, what the FBI is calling an attempted one that happened not very long ago. And so I think it's that worries me, the way that the algorithms are designed to prioritize engagement above everything else, and that's actually across the board. And what is compromised in that process? Safety, truth, what's hateful or not hateful. I just think that actually is the crux of all of this. And now every investigation I do and every piece of analysis I do actually comes back to that same point.
And how are the BBC going to be using you for the US election? And are there any other new analytical technologies you're hoping that you can use as part of the coverage? Because we often see you on the news, BBC News at 10, wandering around with the BBC Verify, all these kind of very snazzy, for want of not sounding too old, graphics and boards and stuff. What's that going to look like this time around?
So for the US election, my kind of main things I've been doing are this "Why Do You Hate Me USA" podcast series. So a lot of that's been kind of out and about, and we filmed out and about. For the election itself, I'm going in a couple of weeks now to the States for a few weeks. And I'm doing some investigations with my undercover voters, my American ones. So I'm interrogating their feeds, tracking down the people who are sharing this stuff, looking at the battle over my undecided voters feed and what that means. And in order to kind of visualize those, we have some lovely graphics that kind of bring to life the undercover voters and like their characters and who they are and the posts they're seeing and all that sort of thing. In some ways, the stuff I investigate can often be quite challenging visually, because for podcasts and online, it's sort of quite straightforward. You can be like, well, I've been investigating this thing on social media and I've tracked these people down and here's what happened, or here's what I've revealed. Whereas visually, often it involves lots of Marianna scrolling on phones and sitting on her laptop.
I'm doing some research.
Yeah, exactly. And also, working out how to use the screens, which have been a kind of really exciting addition to our newsroom, to visualize like, right, okay, I've investigated this and I've tracked these people down and let's kind of reveal who they are and take the audience with us and so on. So I think there's more we're going to try out just in terms of particularly the feel of, I'm a really big advocate for making it feel like you're taking the audience with you. I think now people really like that. And if you think of like YouTube or other social media sites, it's what people do so well, is like take the audience with them. And I think we do that brilliantly for podcasts and we do it brilliantly for online. And sometimes it's a bit more challenging for telly just because of how telly works. So I'd love to do more of that. We've got election night itself, and I'm going to be using my undercover voters and analysing their feeds. The undercover voters are in some ways kind of my own nifty new tool, although I've been using them for a bit now, which just allow me to investigate what different people are seeing within their echo chambers and what their algorithms are pushing them. And it allows you to spot disinformation, hate, other conspiracy theories, sort of ahead of time often, or like before it really, really picks up steam. It just helps you understand how people can be viewing this election through totally different prisms.
Yeah.
And I think my undecided voter in particular, who I have called Gabriella, will be so valuable this election, because she is ultimately probably the kind of person that decides what happens. And just to see the battle for her unfold. And obviously the social media world is not the only battle. There's people out and about, canvassing, doorsteps and so on. Yeah, I just think it's a really interesting way of telling the story and bringing it to life, and doing it on the election program as well, so that people are kind of feeling like they're constantly plugged into how most people are consuming this, which will be on their social media feeds.
And I do think it's great that you do break down the voters and you do kind of go with different demographics, different ages, levels of diversity and what have you. Because I think we do that a lot as an industry. I know that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out the character that might be watching and engaging and who we're aiming the content at. But this is almost like doing that the other way round, isn't it? It's actually like following them and allowing us to observe what they're doing. And I find that really fascinating as a way of storytelling and really effective news and podcast coverage. So was that something that you were really keen to pursue and kind of take down this certain trajectory?
Yeah, I was. And I think it's because we all kind of consume, like if you think about when you're on your phone, like most people don't see all of the things that you see or you're being recommended all day long. And so I really felt like actually you need to investigate and enter people's kind of subjective social media worlds in order to better understand why they think what they think and what's happening. And it's kind of impossible to draw that direct line between what people are recommended on their feeds and then how they behave in the real world, and
Yeah.
how they vote and so on. But it does just give you some insight into what's going on and what people are seeing. It's like a little window into that world, and
Yeah.
I think it's so valuable because it allows you to tap into a whole range of different experiences, match that up with real people in the real world and like what they're seeing, and how that happens. And also, for me, really importantly, hold the social media companies accountable, because you can say on this social media feed this was recommended, or why were you recommending this? Like you can prove that happened, whereas otherwise it's very hard to kind of prove what the algorithms are doing and how they work, because there's not a huge amount of information we're given by the companies about exactly how their algorithms work and on what basis. So I think they're a really brilliant kind of tool for accountability too, and holding people to account in that way.
We've got a really interesting question that's just come in along these kinds of lines, really. It said, Marianna, you've mentioned X not responding to right of reply requests. Do you feel that social media companies can be obstructive when conducting investigations, or are they just too big to contact and cooperate easily?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you so much. I think that it's important to understand how yeah, I think the social media companies, so like X, for example, have taken a very unique approach kind of versus the other companies, that essentially they don't seem to be engaging with journalists who work for what they would term mainstream media organizations. They just don't respond. The other companies do respond. Often they actually respond quite, I'm trying to think of the right adjective, quite actively to you. Yeah. And you'll get in a bit of a back and forth, and they will send you a statement and so on. And they are, as is always the case with right of replies, defending their interests and standing up for their company, and you're, telling them what you've revealed and so on. On the whole, I think that actually there can often be a kind of, it can sometimes feel like you're just knocking on the door again and again and raising the same things, and you get the same kind of statements back, and it might
Mm.
sometimes feel a little bit like, what's the point in this? Is it pointless? Why do I keep asking these people the same questions? But actually it's really, really valuable, because if you think of any kind of scandal that's occurred in recent times, has involved people just repeatedly like knocking on the door saying, this is happening, this is still happening, this is still happening. And so I think you have to, even just as a point of record, you want to have kept going back to the companies, and you want to have kept asking them those questions. And even if
Mm.
they say the same things and it doesn't feel like it's making a difference, you are revealing to the general public what's going on. And so I find, in some ways, at least when the companies are responding to you, you do feel like they are in some way having to think about what you are revealing, even if they disagree with it or counter it or what have you. Whereas with X, you just feel like there's no interest, at least because they're not responding to you, in engaging with what you're
Mm.
saying. And so, those investigations do almost slightly feel like they're going into a void. But, there are people reading them who are having to make, or watching them or listening to them, who are making decisions about social media companies and what they can do and
Yeah.
can't do and so on. So it's always kind of that art, I guess, journalism of revealing stuff that's going on, putting it to the companies, getting your right of reply, and also not being, and I would say this as advice to any kind of young journalist, and advice certainly I've had from working with BBC Panorama, that like you should never ever be, obviously you want to make sure that your reporting is rigorous and revelatory, and it stands up to scrutiny, but don't allow yourself to be intimidated, which often are the tactics that are deployed in right of reply processes. And that's not to say that the social media companies do that, but kind of across the board, really, that people will be quite bolshy because they're defending their interests, and you've got to stick up too for your, for your investigation, your
Yeah.
journalism, and actually right of reply processes, I really weirdly really like them, because I think it's a chance to really sort of go toe to toe with the companies. It's kind of the whole point of it often, is to reveal this stuff to them as much as it is to the audience.
And is that accountability? That's what you're doing, isn't it, on behalf of the viewer? You're saying, look, we've found this, we've discovered this. What's your response? We
Yeah,
want to be able to communicate that.
yeah, and that, particularly when I'm speaking to people who've been harmed by what's being shared on social media, affected by conspiracy theories or hate, have even lost loved ones, or loved ones they've lost have been targeted by horrible hate and conspiracy theories. Um, you're kind of standing up on their behalf as well, and you're standing up on behalf of the audience more broadly, because it is our job to hold power to account. That's like why we
Mhm.
exist. And so I think that you never want to give up on that process, because that is very much what you intend to do, what you are sort of supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But it can sometimes be a frustrating process when you're kind of not getting responses. But that is kind of how this kind of stuff works. And you think about some of the really shocking scandals that have been revealed, including, for example, the post office scandal, where, it took years and years of people knocking on the door saying there's something wrong here, there's something wrong here. And, I think of some of the kind of words that have been spoken about Paul Foot, or people that worked for Private Eye before, the satirical magazine, but also that does a lot of investigative journalism. And again, they're the example of a kind of publication that keeps knocking on the door, doesn't stop, because actually that's how this works, really. And that would be one of my kind of big bits of advice, I guess, particularly for people kind of thinking about getting into journalism, is to like find something that you want to investigate, an area, a specialism, and like really stick at it and run at it, because I think that's valuable, not just for you, but for the general public as well.
I've got an interesting question just coming from Norma, actually. I don't know if you're in a capacity to be able to answer this, but what advice would you give to someone whose family or loved ones have fallen victim to conspiracy theories and disinformation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one that, unfortunately, I'm more than happy to answer it, but unfortunately, lots of people ask me because they don't know what to do. And almost everyone seems to know someone. It might be a friend, a family member, a next door neighbor, a colleague who has kind of fallen into this stuff. My best advice would be, and this is from speaking to psychologists as well as people who've kind of escaped the rabbit hole, as they call it, or people who have loved ones who've been affected by this. The first would be to kind of really question why rather than what. So actually try and figure out how they've got to this point, untangle legitimate concerns and questions they have from disinformation and conspiracy theories. I think encourage them to question their sources, like where are they getting this from, who, how, what's going on. Encourage them to really do that. And then you can kind of say, oh, hang on a second, this person's got a track record of sharing stuff that's not true, or this person, seems to be making money out of this, or why is this going on? And then the final thing is actually to kind of have a bit of patience, which can feel quite hard sometimes. It's easy to get annoyed when someone's saying something that perhaps not to be true, or that you don't agree with. But actually, giving them that kind of empathy a little bit, like the time of day, just to hear what they have to say, understand why they've got to that point. This isn't that way, it won't be something that happens overnight. It probably requires like quite a lot of conversations to get someone to realize what's going on, and them feeling like you're on their team rather than against them will be a positive thing, even when sometimes that feels like a hard thing to do.
I think that's really, really good advice. Thank you for that. We've got another one from Sam Downey in Bristol. He or she, sorry, I don't know if it's a man or woman. Is there any other areas of investigation that aren't social media related that you're interested in looking into, subjects such as data breaches, fake companies, exploitation, OpenAI, for example? They are a disabled journalist and would love to hold companies to account.
Well, thank you so much for your question. I mean, all of those areas you've just highlighted are so worthy of investigation, and doing and running at. As we've kind of just been talking about, they're not necessarily very easy because these companies are kind of like fortresses in some ways. They don't always have very sort of recognizable heads. It's hard to do interviews. I should have said earlier that, I'm the disinformation and social media correspondent at the BBC, and not a single boss of a social media company has agreed to speak to me on any issue for more than 2 years, if not more, which is pretty revealing about how this works. I tend to focus on very much on kind of social media investigations and algorithms and trolls and conspiracy theories, only because it keeps me sufficiently busy, and I almost don't have room for anything else. But there are so many kind of other areas that link to this, just as you identify, everything around sort of data breaches, everything around scammers and scams. And I think that it's often helpful if you're doing these kinds of stories to think about the layers of accountability. So you've got the people who are harmed or affected by this stuff. You've got the people who are maybe sharing this stuff or involved in some way, but they're not necessarily like the big bad guy. You've then got the person who might be, carrying out the scam, or in some ways conspiracy theories are a little bit like scams sometimes too, who are sharing this stuff and who are gaining from it. Maybe they're making money, maybe they're growing their following, or so have you. And it's important to hold them to account, but also kind of understand how they got there. And then you've got the social media companies, or in like you mentioned, OpenAI, or other companies that also benefit from the particular technologies at play here, and what's going on. So I think thinking about it like that is helpful. My biggest bit of advice when covering these kinds of stories would be that they can often feel quite kind of inhuman, for want of a better word, like quite tech and like unrelatable. And I think the more that you can kind of like humanize it and bring it to life and actually show the impact it has and why it matters, then I think that is a really good way of drawing in audiences, and particularly audiences who maybe wouldn't traditionally be interested in this stuff. Like I find a lot of my stuff is really popular with what we call at the BBC kind of underserved audiences, younger audiences,
Yeah.
and so on. Yeah, so I think that would be my kind of main bit of advice, because some of that stuff can feel quite like data breaches and AI and stuff can feel almost a little bit like untouchable in that way. You think, oh, how am I going to bring this to life and help audiences understand how this affects our society and day-to-day lives? And I think often when you start at that point and you try and think of something kind of, a story, and it's all about storytelling as well. That is what, journalism is, and investigative journalism is, thinking about like how you can tell that story, who tells it, and how you reveal it, and what case you might investigate that's emblematic of something wider. I think all of that is a really good way of approaching kind of pitching and working out what you want to do.
Thank you for that. We have an anonymous attendee here asking whether you feel supported by the BBC when these trolls come after you.
Yes, I have brilliant kind of editors at the BBC who I have brilliant editors at the BBC who are really engage with what I do. They really kind of care about making sure that I'm safe and talking through my trolling and so on. I do think there's been a kind of wider increase in understanding about online abuse more generally, both at the BBC and across the media, and people realizing it's something that has to be kind of factored in, that people have to think about both their safety online and then their safety offline as well. I've had examples of people turning up at my place of work, being abusive outside work. This isn't just limited actually to the online world. It kind of spills out into the real world too. And I'm sure people have seen
Camp outside the BBC once. Was that?
Yeah, there was someone sort of living in a tent outside the BBC for a period of time who was abusive to me on several occasions and sort of chased me to my cab, and was someone who very much subscribes to these kinds of conspiracy theories. And that has happened in different ways several times. This is all about how it normalizes physical kind of harassment offline, abuse offline. So the BBC have been brilliant at supporting me in that way. But I do just think in general, people are, even now compared to when I first started my job, much more aware of like why we should factor in online abuse, and being much more proactive and preemptive about it. Like whenever I have an investigation or a podcast series out, we sort of know that will happen, and we flag it and think about it in a way that perhaps initially we'd be much more reactive to those situations and then deal with the hate that followed accordingly. And I think anyone who is experiencing online abuse, it's so important, whether you're a journalist or not a journalist, anyone, just feeling like you can talk to someone about it. Like no amount of online abuse is too little. Like if you receive any message that makes you feel uncomfortable or upsets you or isn't nice, that you don't need to be receiving crazy amounts like I do to take it seriously. And actually it's always better to be safe than sorry. Like it's always better to be a little bit cautious and talk it through and work out how you can deal with it, and how you deal with it yourself and how you feel about it, but then also how you're dealing with it in quite a practical sense of like feeling safe and feeling safe online as well, thinking about what personal details you choose to share and not choose to share, what you want people to be able to see, what's on private, what isn't. I have different social media accounts, a private one and a public one on Instagram for kind of like friends and family. I don't post pictures of my friends and family because when I do, they when I vaguely even mention them, they become the target of trolls. And even my poor family cat has become the target of trolls. She's the only one who ever gets a feature. I know.
Not a cat.
I know. Luckily, she's a cat, so she doesn't know. I think that it's just all about kind of like being a little bit ahead of the game on this stuff. And I hope, if anything, that not only does speaking up about online abuse, allow me to investigate my own case and hold the companies to account and police and whoever else are involved in dealing with this, policymakers too, politicians, but also that it helps people understand that it's not normal and we like shouldn't think of it as normal. And I think there's a risk that it kind of becomes just this thing that we're all supposed to kind of tolerate and put up with. And this isn't just people hurting your feelings, it's the really nasty, abusive, discriminatory, extreme stuff. It disproportionately will affect women, it disproportionately will affect people who are experiencing racist abuse and other forms of hate. So I just think if you're someone who experiences it, no amount is too little, and absolutely talk to your editors, talk to people. I'm always happy for people to message me if they're experiencing online abuse and they want advice about, how they can deal with it.
Yeah, and just working in this realm of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories make you feel more positive or more negative about the general outlook?
I actually would say, interestingly, that it does make me feel more positive, in so much as so many of the people I meet who are drawn into conspiracy theories or even sharing hate or, causing harm on social media, they're often like perfectly nice. And then you meet them and you
Mhm.
ask them questions and they've kind of behaved in a way that they either regret or they kind of almost don't realize the impact of what they're doing.
Keyboard warrior type, they'll type it
Yeah,
before
yeah, it's like they
instant
didn't really think about
face.
it. And so I
Mm.
think that actually when I meet people broadly, I think that they're good people. I don't think there's anything kind of necessarily very sort of innately bad about them, but they are just causing harm because of what they're doing. I meet so many brave people who, stand up against conspiracy theories and trolling. I think of Manchester Arena survivors who've experienced horrendous conspiracy theories and tactics targeting them, of really brave, grieving parents whose children have been harmed and lost their lives because because of, in part, social media, and who've shown such courage. So there are people who are really willing to kind of stand up against this stuff, and I think that's so sort of inspiring in many ways. And then I think also it's that actually, like most people in general, like the people who get in touch with me, the people who read and watch and listen to my investigations, like even when I talk about trolling, I get so many brilliant messages from people who love my journalism, who love what I do, who are interested in this topic, who really care about it, like everyone. And so sometimes it feels to me like when the social media accountability is slow, the willingness of like everybody to actually kind of arm themselves against these sorts of tactics and to say, oh, actually, I don't like this very much, is a really positive thing. So it makes me think that, at some point in the future, there probably is a solution to lots of this. But it's not really my job to come up with the solution. It's just my job to expose all the problems.
No, it's completely fair. But also, we have a question here from Rennie Wyndham. Thank you for the question. Will the increasing use of Chat GPT and AI mean that it will be far quicker and easier to spread misinformation and conspiracy theories?
So I think that's a really good question. And to some extent, yes, it's a kind of another tool added to the arsenal of people who want to spread stuff that's not true or hateful. The flip side is that I think that the flip side is that actually a lot of the tried and tested tactics, so people using memes, people sharing stuff that's just false, but it's just a post or whatever else, they're still working very effectively. I've also investigated conspiracy theory newspapers, so I don't think we should let AI ever distract us from the fact that the other tactics are working really well at spreading disinformation and hate and other things on social media. And then if you add this in, it's kind of like another layer of, oh, okay, now we've got AI too, and that can be abused. Very recently, the latest episode of Why Do You Hate Me USA, I investigated a case of a faked AI clip of a principal, a head teacher in a town called Pikesville, which is a suburb of Baltimore. He was targeted with a faked clip of him making racist and anti-Semitic comments that he never made. But at the time, everybody believed it to be true. The school he worked at was in a neighborhood where there were sizable Black and Jewish communities who were understandably absolutely outraged and shocked by this clip. People believed it. He was placed on leave pending an investigation. There was kind of widespread condemnation. And then it later transpired that it had been faked using AI, and the person who's been arrested was a former member of staff at that school. And I think that that is a really good example of a very scary case of how AI can be abused and used to target and tear apart local communities. And the most worrying thing was that after people knew it was faked, quite a lot of people still almost believed it to be real. It didn't kind of change their feelings about it because they have genuinely experienced racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. And so they just kind of felt like, well, it's what I think people like that think, so that's what I'm going to believe. And there are other people within the local community I spoke to who said they were really upset because it undermines real examples of racism and discrimination they've experienced. So I think that there are examples like that that are really shocking, and I think AI does kind of complicate and muddy the water in that sense. It does make it even harder, and particularly when something is faked audio, and particularly when it's maybe of someone who's not that famous, like someone within a community, it's harder for them to disprove it straight away if it's not evident immediately from the recording itself. And I think that's something we should really be looking out for. I am heartened though by, I've done quite a few talks recently that kids have attended where they've made really good comments about AI. And so talking about my book that I've written recently, I had like a kid say, oh, if it has more than one thing, if it has 6 fingers, does that mean it's AI generated? And I was so impressed that he knew that. And another kid, I was showing a clip of me on BBC Breakfast and he said, oh, that's fake news. And I kind of thought, oh no, what's going on here? And then it later transpired that he said, oh no, it was really rainy in Manchester this morning, but it's sunny in the background there. So it's good to know that I think there's an element of kind of social media literacy coming in too, which I think is in some ways a defense against this, and is something that some countries, Finland for example, have had quite a lot of success in dealing with in kind of combating disinformation by having pretty comprehensive social media literacy courses, which on their own, don't stop people believing this stuff, but can help people spot stuff, including around AI, which I think there's kind of quite wide public understanding of the damage AI could do.
Yeah, it's encouraging, like you say, though, that there's an awareness of it, and there seems to be more education and academia that's cultivating people being a bit more questioning, or like verifying sources, or fact checking and checking a few different places before just taking something as gospel, or that's the right answer, or what have you. But another question now from Isa Farfor. Thank you for the question. I'm really wondering if you've done any work about misinformation from Israel, because that conflict seems to trigger hate not only in the Middle East, but here in the UK too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I have a bit, and actually, next episode of Why Do You Hate Me USA, which is coming out on Monday, is all about two students in New York, one who is pro-Palestinian and one who is Jewish, both who have been targets of doxing and very extreme online abuse, and that in turn has kind of shaped their views on social media and their social media feeds. And I really kind of delve into the polarization and hate and abuse that has surrounded the online conversation around the war in Gaza and the Hamas attacks on Israel. I did an investigative report at this almost exactly a year ago that was about two little boys, one who was called Omar and one who was called Omer. Omer was killed in his kibbutz on the 7th of October by Hamas, and Omar was killed by Israeli bombardment near to Gaza City. And they were 4 years old. They almost had exactly the same names. And so on social media, people falsely suggested that they were not real. They were dolls. They were faked. And those tactics have been very widely used to undermine real examples of violence against civilians, children especially. And so I investigated that tactic and what had happened. I tracked down the family members, friends of these two little boys who were distraught, not only obviously that they'd lost their little boys, but then also that those very painful kind of killings were being undermined in this way on social media, including by very, very powerful accounts. I had to write a reply, the Israeli government's Twitter account, who had shared this video and who came back to tell me that, the BBC accused the BBC of spreading misinformation and didn't respond to my points. I had to contact various other accounts that have posted in support of Hamas, that had shared abuse directed at this little, one of the other little boys. So it's a really important topic to investigate. And I think that, sometimes it can feel perhaps secondary to obviously the level of violence that we're seeing and the number of civilians who've been killed on the ground. But I think it's really important because it explains a lot of, how the conversation around the war in Gaza is unfolding here and now, the violence in Lebanon as well, and the Iran strikes on Israel. And so, I hope that you'll enjoy listening. I think the episode, the one at least that's about to come out, might be relevant to what you're talking about, which is slightly more about kind of students and the way that online abuse and hate have affected them in relation to the ongoing war. But that kind of delves into the way that this unfolds, almost the projection of kind of hate into other places.
It is scary though, like you say, isn't it, when you're seeing accounts of really horrific experiences discredited almost in that sense. But yeah,
it's just it's so dehumanizing for people. And I think of the families of both of those little boys who are just absolutely like heartbroken. Yeah, and you can't even imagine it. I mean, you can't even imagine it. The worst possible thing has happened to you, and then you're forced to kind of grapple with the idea that it was, people suggesting that it wasn't real, or that the person you love and care about hadn't been killed, especially when this is little kids we're talking about. So I think it's really shocking, but it's for that reason it's really important that we kind of do humanize this stuff so that people realize, like, these are real people. We're not talking about abstract children who've been killed. We're talking about real children who've been killed by this violence, which often it feels as though particularly people who are using these kinds of tactics on social media want to undermine and almost desensitize people to that fact.
Yes, compassion, show a little compassion. Before we finish, we've run out of time, it's gone so quickly, but the recognition that you've had recently, and also your book Beyond the Trolls, your journey through conspiracy land. You've also been quoted before as working sociopathically hard. But I wanted to ask you whether this kind of recognition, it must be satisfying, I'm sure, and the impact that you are now having. But what advice would you give to any young journalists out there looking to pursue this kind of thing as a career? Because, like we were saying earlier, you couldn't have gone to your careers advisor and say, "This is what I want to do with my life." So, what advice would you offer?
Yeah, no, it's very exciting to get those kinds of awards, and they almost feel like um, a little bit of a, I feel so lucky to do the job that I do anyways, and to kind of investigate the topics I do, and I really love doing it. And it's so important, I think, for both the people who kind of are involved in my investigations, and then also, the general public who listen and watch and read and everything else. So I think a little bit of me thinks, yeah, I kind of just feel really lucky to be doing that anyway. So when you're shortlisted for an award or you win it, it's just a really exciting kind of thing on top of that, which is so brilliant to receive. I think that my best advice would be, and it was advice that I was given, was this is a kind of constantly evolving landscape now. The same jobs that existed 10 years ago might not exist in 30 years' time, because the way we consume media and the way news media works and the way current affairs works, it is evolving and changing. And so I think always think about what you want to do rather than what you want to be. So what do you like doing? Like, I love doing investigations. I love doing them in a range of different formats. I love tracking people down. I love meeting real people. I love sort of, exposing the consequences in that way. Like, what things do you really like doing? Are you someone who loves certain medians? Are you someone who loves particular topics or particular areas? Do you love kind of producing stuff? Are you really into, do you want to be on air? Just think about kind of like what you really love doing, and be guided by that as much as you can. And often when you start out, you do a whole mixture of different things, and sometimes they won't be things you love doing, but they teach you a lot about what you do love doing, which I think is important and allows you to kind of pursue that. The other really good bit of advice I had was to specialize before you generalize. That actually it's really valuable as a young journalist or a new journalist to work out an area where you can kind of offer something that other people can't. And if there's a particular topic or an area that you almost become a little bit like the expert in, I think that's a really positive thing, and kind of opens up more opportunities. And even though it can feel a little bit like it's a fast changing world, that's quite a positive thing in general, because it means there are more opportunities, there are more spaces, there are more podcasts, there are more, you can make your own content on YouTube or TikTok or other places that you might want to. So I think that the kind of ever-changing, use the ever-changingness of it as a benefit to you, rather than something that makes it more difficult, even though it can make it more difficult as well.
There's such sage advice. Thank you so much, Marianna. And sadly, that is all we've got time for. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to Marianna for your time with us here this evening. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure the audience will have too. Thank you for your brilliant questions. You can find more information about other fabulous events available from the Royal Television Society at rts.org.uk/events. And we do hope to see you soon. Thanks, Marianna.
Thank you so much. Bye.